City Council for March 31st, 2020 at 6:08, I believe. So before we get started, I want to make the following announcement. Those calling in, if you would like to speak during public comment, like to speak regarding an item on the agenda in place of a form, please email your request to speak to cityclerk@templecity.com and indicate which item you wish to speak regarding. You can do that right now. Okay. All right. So I will ask our clerk to roll call.
Thank you, Mayor. Councilmember Fish?
Here.
Councilmember Mann?
Here.
Councilmember Sternquist?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Yu? Mayor Pro Tem Yu?
Here, can you not hear me?
Yes.
Now,
Mayor Chavez?
here. Okay, thank you. Everyone is present. We will now move to public comments. City Council will now hear public comments regarding items not listed on the agenda. Ms. City Clerk, do we have any emails that you would like to state right now?
Thank you, Mayor. I don't see any email public comments for just the item not on the agenda.
Okay. Have anybody out there that wishes to make a public comment? Okay, hearing none, I will close the comment. We will now move on to item number 4, new business. Just so for my colleagues, before we get started on the new business, just wanted to kind of briefly kind of state some ground rules, just so that the meeting hopefully will go without a hitch. And I know sometimes it's difficult when we're talking and some are talking over others. So if you don't mind, when we will hear the reports, of course, from staff, and then when it gets time for public comment or council comments, I will go ahead and I'll call on each of you. So each of you will get an opportunity to speak. So hopefully that'll work for everybody. And of course, at any time, if you have any quick questions or want to, ask anything, of course, you can do that at any time. So, okay, so we'll now move on to item A, overview of temporary emergency action related to the continuity of city services and personnel requests for direction. So, Mr. City Manager, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mayor Chavez, members of the council. In order to maintain a continuity of operations while abiding by the Safe at Home health order, on March 19th, the city instructed all staff that have the ability to work at home and field staff to perform essential duties to perform those, and utilizing a special emergency administrative leave protocols. Those have been detailed to you prior, and we've discussed those at our special meetings before. This is really an extraordinary event that requires practices and operational protocols that are not the norm. We are operating under these conditions with modified services so that we can provide them both safely for the community and safely for all of the employees. The staff report details out the fiscal impacts and what we are dealing with operationally right now. A couple notes to point out to the council as we have this discussion. We have the great advantage of being a contract city. One of those advantages right now is utilizing the LA County Sheriff and Fire Department and LA County Public Works and other partner agencies, including the private sector, in assisting us in providing essential services. One of the disadvantages, though, at times is that we do have a full-time staff of only 40 employees and about, on average, 40 part-time employees who average about 20 hours of work per week. So in the event that this COVID-19 emergency continues going forward, the challenge that we have as an agency in order to provide in-house with our services, if 5, 10, 15, 20% of our employees are essentially quarantined or their family members are quarantined related to this emergency, it will be a challenge for us going forward. Hence why we took the action that we did starting on March 19th, to provide this administrative leave protocol so that it would provide for all employees, both part-time and full-time, for those who are working, flexing their time, telecommuting, and some in cases also just waiting for a phone call to be on call, to be able to provide us with the greatest amount of flexibility. This again provides us with the optimal level of services that we can to continue to provide the public. It is a modified level of service, not a full service as we normally operate. One other point in the staff report that's been brought out is that it is inevitable that we will see a reduction in revenue due to this event. But because of the fact that we're only in this less than the second week of this event, it's really hard to gauge what level of revenue reductions the city will see. Two things I will point out to the council, as you all know, having gone through the budget process several times together. The great advantage of the city is that we are a property tax-based city. So even during the Great Recession, we did not see the V type of downward slide and then upward recovery. It was more of a U shape. And it is hard to anticipate what this event will do. It has been sudden, it has been immediate, but we are estimating what that will be. And over the next few weeks, I think we will have a better idea of what some of those revenue projections will be going forward. So, but in terms of the immediate fiscal impact from now, at least till May 1st, as described, we're not requiring or at this time asking the council to provide additional appropriations. And there's several factors that play into that. One, the funds that have been budgeted for operations are already there, meaning we're not spending more than we're already authorized to spend. We are providing compensation for work, telecommuting work, and for on-call status, which is different than our normal operations, but we are not spending more than what we thought. The best analogy, and Mr. Murphy has kind of pointed this out, I think to several of you as well, is that in most emergencies, you anticipate, okay, we're going to spend our emergency funds for, extra overtime or capital or other things that you would have to deal with if you had like an earthquake. This is an extraordinary event in which things are in part adjusted, some services not being provided at the levels that they were before. So we're not drawing down off those funds just yet. Lastly, too, as pointed out, a couple more things as pointed out in your staff report as well. Our mid-year budget projection showed a potential operating surplus, an estimated operating surplus of over $500,000, and that the city does have about 1.4 million in designated budgeted or designated reserves for a local economic uncertainty event, which staff would argue that this is one of those events. So the current operational status that we're in right now, using the protocols that we're using and looking out towards May 1st, allows us to be in compliance with the health order and still provide a level of service to the community. Any questions you can have of the staff report or anything else? Myself, I'm here. Susan Pagaras, our Administrative Services Director, is also on the line for any questions that you may have. And that summarizes my report, Mayor.
Mayor, I have a few questions.
Hold on, Vince. I don't know if you heard, but so before we go into the questions, just so everyone is kind of can participate in a certain portion. What I'd like to do is, does that conclude your report, Brian?
Yes, Mayor Chavez.
Okay, so what I'd like to do is, we're now ready to council comments. So what I'd like to do is call on each of you individually for your comments. So if you can possibly wait until you get called upon, and then you'll have the opportunity to say whatever you need to say. So we'll go ahead and start with Council Member Fish. Do you have any council comments at this point?
Well, I do, but I would.
I'm sorry, Mayor, before we start, Mr. Mayor, this is still questions before the public has a chance to speak, before you and your colleagues actually give your thoughts. This is still questions for Brian. Thank
Yeah.
you, sir.
Okay, so this is questions, not comments.
Well, yes, okay, go ahead. I
Okay.
stand,
So I don't have any
But-
questions, but
Okay.
I would like, before I make a comment or on anything that I'm thinking, I'd like to listen to the questions from my colleagues.
okay. Councilmember Mann, do you have any questions at this time for staff?
I don't have any questions at this point.
Thank you. Councilmember Sternquist.
No questions.
All right, Mayor Pro Tem, you, questions?
Yeah, I guess I have a little bit trouble in understanding why there's a cost for administrative leave, because at least the way I envision is that whether or not the staff are working or non-working due to the teleworking or stay-at-home order, the whatever budget that we're budgeted for their salary or rate still be the same. Why would there be additional administrative leave cost?
That's a good point, Mayor Pro Tem. There really isn't at this point in time. So we wanted to make sure that we were transparent. And maybe Susan, do you mind kind of also responding to Mayor Pro Tem Yu's question as well?
Yes. This is Susan. Good evening. There are no additional costs for the admin leave. I believe the question is, would you like to continue paying for non-working hours? So the salaries have been budgeted. So yes, you're correct. There's no additional costs. However, it's the piece where they are not working those hours.
So you're referring to folks who on wages, there are not, let's say, just for discussion, let's say if I make $100 a day, and I work 10 hours, so $10 an hour, just for simplicity purpose. And I work only 9 hours, and I have 1 hour left because of teleworking situation. Do I expect to be paid $100 still?
Correct. That's what we have been doing these last 2 weeks.
Where would that $10 come from? That's not
It would be part of the budgeted salaries already.
right. So where does this admin leave fit in?
Well, it's for that $10 that they're not, that 1 hour they are not working would be considered admin leave.
But they currently don't get admin leave, right?
That's correct. Not on a regular operations,
So
not during the
normal-
regular operation, normal operations,
Right.
yes.
But as far as the city is concerned, though, we're not expending more pay. We're not paying people more.
That's
Am I-
correct.
So this is really approving one pot of money going to another pot of money. Am I correct?
Yes,
Account-
you can say that. Uh-huh.
That's one way to look at it, yes.
Mhm.
Except that there's no work being completed for
That-
some of them.
That's correct.
So I guess what I had trouble understanding was, Mr. City Manager, you referred to that we don't have to tap into our reserve. But if this is money that had been accounted for one way and now being paid out through another way, there should never be any need for any money from the reserve. Am I correct?
At this point in time, yes, that's correct. And that's what we have projected through May 1st. The question will be what happens after May 1st? And that's what you'll have as staff, we will have to come up with a plan to address that and see what kind of work orders and what the LA County health official restricts in terms of type of, if the safe at home order still stays in place, how does that impact the manner in which we direct our staff to work?
But Brian, this is Cynthia, it wouldn't necessarily, whatever they decide, I mean, wouldn't really have a bearing on the people that don't have a job to do, right? Because if they don't have a job to perform and the county says, well, this is the new requirement, unless they say you have to pay workers, I mean, it doesn't seem relevant to me.
Okay.
Or perhaps, Mr. Mayor, I can just ask one more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think where the reserve question comes in is if there is a reduction in our revenue, right?
That's correct.
Exactly. sir.
However, let me also ask the question then, are we also expecting to see perhaps a reduction in our expenses because certain things that would have been expanded, let's say you have activity in the park, where you have to buy certain things as gifts, for example, as award for kids and stuff. And now you don't have to do that because stack activity has passed. So
You're correct, yes.
Okay, is it,
thanks.
thank you.
Thank you.
I got a couple of quick questions. Brian, on the revenue reductions that you mentioned in the staff report, you indicate that there was estimated surplus of $523,000. Would it be fair to say that you're assuming that I mean, those are the revenues, but those may be questionable in the future, right? Because at this point, we're not really sure what those are going to be, correct?
Yeah, since Mayor Chavez, since we're really in the midst of this event right now, it's really hard for us to gauge what that will look like. But I think, and Susan could speak to this as well, we're pretty comfortable where we stand right now through May 1st.
Okay, good. Thank you. Also, and you talk about leave, and you didn't really touch on the new federal laws that are going into effect that may have an impact, but in the staff report, you indicated leave due to school or daycare closure. Is there anything as far as documentation or proof that would be necessary for that? Are you aware of it?
Yes, there is. Some guidance just recently came out, and Mr. Murphy's firm has provided us with that additional guidance in order to make sure we effectuate for those who are eligible for that leave and make sure we're doing it properly as well.
Perfect. Okay. Okay, those are all the questions I have. Does anybody from the council have any further questions before we move on to public comment? Okay, so then I will open public comment. I'll ask our city clerk if there are any public comment emails or anything that's been expressed to you.
Mayor, no, I did not receive any email public comments regarding this item.
Okay, thank you. So I will close public comment, and so now we will now get to our council comments, and I will go ahead and call on everyone in order as we did before. Councilmember Fish, any further comments on this?
The only comment I have is I see here we are trying to decide if we do approve this, to approve it until either April 19th or May 1st. And I will say initially, before Safer at Home was extended to May, I think it's 5th, I was leaning more towards going toward April 19th. But since the Safer at Home that is going to be continued to May, I would like to see it go until May 1st. I do want to remind everyone that because it is an emergency situation, I believe that our city manager can use any of our employees for emergency. Is that correct? For any emergency?
Yes, they are all employees at this point who are currently employed with the city are considered disaster workers. And I am able to utilize them as long as I'm doing it safely and with their skill sets and interchangeably.
And they do also have to be available within the working hours, correct?
not only available in the working hours, but also on call if needed as well.
Okay. That's all.
Brian, do we know how many of those workers are CERT trained?
Honestly, off the top of my head, I don't know. I can see that Brian, if you don't mind, I can see Brian Arzumi's on the line. Brian, Mr. Arzumi, do you have any idea?
Yeah, we have probably approximately 10 to 12 employees that are CERT. Some of them have took classes way back in 2009, and some may have been most recent in 2014.
That's fantastic. I just think that's something we could keep on the back burner for future part-time employees to possibly get some training. But I think that's really good to hear.
I agree. Mayor, I'm finished.
Okay, thank you. All right, Councilmember Mann. Any last comments?
Yeah, I think what I would like to see is, as mentioned in the staff report, this situation is highly fluid and we're seeing a lot of rapid changes recently. So I think as we approach the end of this timeline, which if I read correctly is May, I would appreciate if we have a better idea of, I guess, what kind of plan we have moving forward, specific changes, sort of the framework of how each department is changing its functions. I can't pinpoint anything specific right now, but I'd imagine just within the past 2 weeks, there's already been a lot of ideas of how staff is being utilized in a variety of different ways. That's all I really want to say at this point.
Thank you very much. Councilman Turnquist?
Just a couple of things. I think that, we're fiscally strong as a city, and I think that, it's through no fault of anyone that we're here. We're with this coronavirus in our communities, and I think whatever we can do to help our employees, I think we should. I think it's I think these employees they have livelihoods also, and many of them were, especially our part-timers, were in school, and now that some of the schools have closed down, maybe they don't have opportunities to go online. It's a difficult situation for everyone to have to go and find another job. I mean, people might say, well, you can go to Amazon or work in the market, but those people are put into high risk situations also, and I don't think we want to have to do that to our employees. So I think it's a smart thing to do. I think it's a humanitarian thing to do, and we're a small city. We always pride ourselves on saying, we are a family and we look out for one another, and I think these are the times when we have to make these policy decisions and step up to the plate for them. That's pretty much it.
Thank you very much. Mayor Pro Tem, you.
Yeah, I concur with everything that's been said. I think as a city, we must be sensitive to our staff needs. And this is such a crazy time with a lot of anxiety going around. I appreciate that we are able to step in and help our staff. But I think in the long run, we don't have to make that decision, obviously. There will be a point where we might have to balance helping our staff versus versus paying somebody for not actually performing. At some point, that we need to take stock and see what it really means. And the other one that because not just our staff is suffering, our residents, at least some of them, will probably face the same situation where they say, well, I am out of job as well, and why is the tax dollar not coming to help me out? in that regard, although that's perhaps a federal and the state question, less so than a city question, but still, if we're helping our city staff, some resident may say, well, how did that help me? I think, at least in my mind, I think we can rationalize some of that by saying that we're trying to keep and continue our city services. It doesn't make sense to not keep our staff. This is important. We have good people that we should keep them at the city. But at some point, we need to re-examine that. And the other part that I think we have in this report is that extra expenses that the city may have to go through. For example, I don't know if the city would have enough detergent, cleaner, gloves, masks, things that the city is probably using up pretty quickly, and how that put us in a, I don't know, there might be other routines that the city manager is instituting that perhaps is costing a certain amount of money. Maybe, I don't know, maybe we would need to bring in special units to do certain things. So I guess it's a fluid, like my fellow councilman was saying. I think we just need to monitor to see how that goes.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I want to thank my colleagues for your comments and insight into all of this. And we know it's a difficult situation. I like the word fluid. It seems to describe it very accurately. Seems to change every day. The more I think that we can keep the status quo when it comes to running our city, I think the better off we are in the long run. I think also the days will help us to help Brian to determine what we can do, what we can't do, and we'll have a better picture as far as moving forward at that point. I would imagine that for whatever decision we make tonight, we will probably have either another meeting or maybe during a regular council discuss this matter further. Whereas by that time, hopefully we'll have more information as well. So I want to thank all of you. That's all I have to say. I basically concur with my colleagues. So at this point, unless there are any further comments, I will go ahead and entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion to approve the recommendation. Tom, can you read the rest? It went off the screen.
Are you talking about the recommendation to continue administratively May 1st?
Yes, it just went off my screen. I'm sorry.
That's fine. That's okay. That's unfortunately part of our learning curve here. So, okay. So that, Mr. City Attorney, is that sufficient for you to?
That will work. We have a motion to continue paid administrative leave through May 1.
I'll
Do we
second
have a
that.
second?
Okay, so
Thank you, sir.
we have a motion and we have a second. So, Madam Clerk, if you will take roll call, please.
Councilmember Fish,
Yes.
Councilmember Mann,
Yes.
Councilmember Sternquist,
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Yu,
Yes.
Mayor Chavez.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much. And now we will move on to item B, consideration of an urgent ordinance of the City Council of the City of Temple City, temporarily prohibiting evictions of residential and commercial tenants arising out of financial impact of COVID-19 pandemic. I think this presentation will start off with our city attorney, Mr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Before you tonight is an urgency ordinance that would place a moratorium on a certain set of evictions. As with all urgency ordinances, it requires at least 4 votes for approval, and it will go into effect immediately if it gets those 4 votes. The moratorium would be based on failure to pay rent. When a tenant can show that the failure to pay rent is due to the financial effects of the COVID-19 virus or to the safer at home orders issued by the County of Los Angeles and the State of California, or by federal order. The moratorium on evictions for that failure to pay rent would be during the period of the current safer at home orders and for 6 months afterwards. The purpose of the 6 months afterwards is to allow tenants to get back to work, or in the case of commercial tenants, reopen their businesses and then to come back current with their rent. For property owners' sake, I want to note that other evictions can still go forward. Breach of lease, destruction of property, things of that nature are not subject to the eviction moratorium. This order, or the moratorium in front of you, is substantially the same as what the County of Los Angeles has already adopted. The cities of Pasadena, Glendale, Alhambra, Duarte, and others have already adopted, and we know there are more on the way. You will know that on Friday, the governor issued an order that put a moratorium on evictions. The governor's order, at least as it stands today, ends at the end of the safer at home orders. That is, eviction proceedings can begin when the safer at home orders end. We believe that what's in front of you is a better balance for tenants, residential and commercial both, because it does give them time to get back to work. I will also note that the governor, in his press conference after issuing his moratorium, said that he wanted local jurisdictions to do more, that he wanted his order to be sort of the last resort. In putting this together and in preparing for tonight, we looked at a couple of other options. The city of Oakland, for example, has a very strong moratorium. It prevents both evictions for non-payment of rent and evictions for any other purpose. But on the other hand, it doesn't cover commercial entities other than small businesses. So a franchisee, for example, may or may not be covered depending on whether they're considered a small business. They also require full payment eventually, just as we would, but they delay it through the end of the order. I want to talk about the way that this would be enforced. It's important for the council and any members of the public viewing this to understand how this would be enforced. An eviction matter ultimately goes to a judge. If the tenant and landlord don't agree on an eviction, the tenant stays, and the landlord has to file what's called an unlawful detainer action. As part of that action, the tenant would get to show to the judge the evidence that the tenant has saying that they should not be evicted because they failed to pay due to COVID-19 or a safer at home order. And at that point, the judge gets to look at the evidence and make a decision. So the city's code enforcement staff, the sheriff's office would not be involved in enforcement. This is strictly a matter that provides a defense for tenants who are going through eviction proceedings. This moratorium, as we say, is set up to go through May 31 and then add 6 months. But it's written in such a way that if the safer at home orders wind up going later, wind up going through June or even July, that 6 month period to come back to even on the rent owed begins when the orders end. Finally, and some of you may have heard Councilmember Sternquist mention this before the meeting, the County of Los Angeles, as I say, was the first entity locally to adopt a moratorium. Today in their meeting, they had a motion to put on a future agenda the expansion of their moratorium to cover all the cities within the county. As you may know, the County Board of Supervisors is not meeting daily or as certainly not as often as they normally do. And they would also have to look at whether they have the power as the public health entity to actually put on a moratorium that covers all their cities. So while they want to do that to protect all the residents of the county, they are also continuing to urge cities to adopt our own moratoria to help out our tenants. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them, whether those be policy-based or legal-based, but that is my report, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start with council questions, and I'll ask Councilmember Mann, do you have any questions?
Mayor Chavez, yes, I do have a question. So just to clarify, the way the ordinance is written is whenever the safer at home order by public health officially declares an end to the COVID-19 emergency, that's when the 6-month clock starts ticking.
Yes, sir.
So it has nothing to do with anything that the state would issue. No, so if the state suddenly decides to issue their own end of emergency declaration in the state of California and public health doesn't do it, we're not listening to what the state is saying. We're listening to what public health is saying.
Correct. And to date, the county has been more strict than the state. So yes, we would be following what public health is telling us.
Okay. That's the only question I have. Thank you.
Thank you. That could turn out to be an interesting legal argument as far as perhaps who takes precedent, state, federal, county. That remains to be seen, I suppose. Okay, Councilmember Fish, any questions at this time?
No, I'm good. That was my question.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem Yu, do you have any questions?
Yes. Well, I certainly understand the reason for the moratorium. But I was also wondering, does the landlord has any relief? Let's say, if that's the only sole income the landlord has, if nobody's paying them, or try not to pay or try to take advantage of this, then does he or she has any, can seek any kind of legal release from, relief from this action?
We don't have anything in this moratorium that would allow them to force the tenants to pay rent if the tenant in question is unable to pay due to COVID-19 or the health orders. The landlord, it is believed, and it is believed by the other jurisdictions, has a greater ability to get a loan of a shorter medium term that would allow them to cover those costs based in part because they have the collateral of the building itself. One of the issues here, perhaps the primary issue here, is the concern with putting tenants, residential tenants, out on the street during this pandemic, and when the finding of any employment that would allow them to pay for housing is at probably its lowest ebb. So no, this does not have any release valve in and of itself, but the general thought behind our moratorium and others is that landlords do have a greater ability to seek loans due to the collateral provided by the building.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Councilmember Sternquist, any questions at this time?
I have spent a lot of time on the phone with Brian and Greg. I have some similar concerns as Vince. I don't think in the world we're living in right now that really there's going to be any equitable solution for this. I do agree that it's a tough time for, tenants to not know where they're going to be tomorrow. I do appreciate that Greg shared that it does not include any other eviction that would not be related to CV-19. And I think that was just the assurance that, I think that property owners needed. But I want to thank you, Greg, publicly for taking the time to answer all my questions this past week, and Brian, you also. So I think to say I'm completely, comfortable with it is a bit of a stretch, but I do think it's the best thing to do under the current circumstances.
Okay, and we'll get to those comments in a little bit, but any further questions? Thank you. Okay, I just had a couple of questions. Greg, is there anything in this ordinance that would prohibit a landlord and a tenant from agreeing themselves for, let's say, rather than no rent, paying a percentage of the rent? Like, let's say the rent is normally $1,000 a month, and the landlord and tenant decide, hey, why don't we agree to $250 a month during the moratorium? Is that allowable, or is there some language that we need that prohibited by this moratorium?
Not prohibited at all. In fact, we anticipate that landlords and longtime tenants, especially our commercial tenants, will try to work out some kind of a deal that, to use the word that's been used before by your council members tonight, sir, is equitable. Tenants that have some ability to pay obviously can work out with the landlord the ability to pay that amount now, and then what they do during the 6-month period to come up even. Perhaps they trade some payment now in exchange for not having to pay the full amount during that 6-month period. That's up to them. That's a private deal, and we're not going to get involved. We're going to leave that one up to the two of them.
But I just want to make sure there's nothing in this ordinance would prohibit that, correct?
Goodness no, sir, not at
Okay.
all.
Perfect. Okay, and then that might be something we may want to publicize as well when we get to that point, if we do. Also, can you clarify what kind of documentation the tenant would actually need? And I'm assuming that has already been addressed or somewhere maybe in further other ordinances have been done. I'm assuming doctor's notes or things like that is something that would be beneficial for the tenant to have.
Sure. Yes, we didn't delineate in the ordinance itself exactly what's required because, again, to use a word that's been used so often, the situation now is so fluid that it's difficult to know what will be had on it. What might be appropriate today might be wholly inappropriate a week from now. But some documentation is required, both a statement from the tenant to the landlord that they cannot pay due to COVID-19 or the stay-at-home orders, and then some documentation. And the documentation, as you say, it could be a financial record. It could be the email that they received from their employer saying that they were being furloughed and no pay will be coming. It could be information from a doctor. In any of those cases, it says here in the ordinance that information may not be shared by the landlord for any purposes unrelated to the future collection of rent. So we're giving the tenant a protection. They can share their health information with their landlord, knowing that it won't go any farther, because we recognize that landlords should be receiving some solid information that they can go off of before they're subject to this ordinance.
And ultimately, that would be up to the court to decide, I would imagine, even under the ordinance.
Yes, sir. And that's, as we say, ultimately, we're going to let the judge weigh how strong that evidence is.
Okay, thank you. Also, last question. I didn't see in this ordinance, I don't know whether there should be, whether or not, or how this issue has been addressed, and that is no increase in rents during this period as well. Has that been discussed or come up?
That is something that was done in the Oakland ordinance, which goes farther than most places. As the council knows, the state of California just put in a very strong limitation on rent increases that became effective the first of this year. And in light of that limitation, we were somewhat, I was somewhat uncomfortable adding that into this moratorium. Again, part of my rationale is I wanted to present to you all something that would put your residents and your businesses on equal footing with those in the nearby county land and in some of the larger nearby cities. I think the best thing we can do is give them the same protections so that if they do go before a judge, that judge is going to have seen this before in those larger jurisdictions. But the other part of that was, again, we're trying to balance fairness to landlords. And if a landlord isn't going to be paid anyway, but was going to do their normal rent increase the limited one that's allowed by the state, and they had timed that for April or May or June based on when their tenancies or when their leases roll over. I didn't want to get in the middle of that. If the council wants to, I'm happy to add that. It's not a problem to add it, but that's really a policy decision for all of you.
Okay, thank you. Those are all the
Yes, sir.
questions. And are there any other questions, Vince?
I have just one more question,
Go ahead.
perhaps for our lawyers here. What other remedy? I mean, this moratorium only disallow eviction, but there are other legal remedies available to the landlord, right? It's not like forgiving the rent; they can still go after. So, what other legal remedies still out there for people that don't pay the rent?
Well, for people that don't pay the rent, yeah, the landlord can go after the rent. And then at the end of the 6-month period after the health orders end, the landlord can evict at that time. Just at this interim period of time, in balancing the equities, we're looking at not forcing people who find themselves suddenly out of work or businesses that have suddenly had to close, not forcing them to vacate in what is a very difficult and unusual situation. But you're correct, sir. They will be able to recover that rent. As the mayor said, they can work out an agreement to do so. They can, upon the end of the moratorium, bring an action to recover all of the rent at that point, as well as evicting the tenant. But this just gives the tenants, commercial and residential both, some time to get back to work.
Okay.
Thanks, Vince. Any other questions from council? Okay, hearing none, I will open up public comment. Madam Clerk, do we have any questions?
Mayor Chavez, I do have 6 emails that were emailed prior to the meeting. If I may, I need to read them into the record.
Go ahead.
I have the first email. The comment is as follows: at these unprecedented times, we need protection from rent evictions, late fees, and accumulation of unpaid rent. We need rent forgiveness and ban late fees. Our homes are our safe zones. Please act fast. Our second comment: I'm definitely against rent moratorium. For information, I am not an apartment complex owner and do not have any properties that I rent out. However, I do not believe a moratorium will help the renters. They need to work out a solution with their landlord. Everyone's circumstances are different and a moratorium hurts everyone. I urge the city council to vote no to a rental moratorium. Public comment number 3, no one should lose their home during a pandemic, and it's great that California declared a moratorium on evictions to prevent this. But when this extraordinary event occurred, people who had been working and were forced to stop through no fault of their own are now facing punishment via endless back rent fee and debt accumulation. Getting back to work again will take time, and it will take those who have lost income even longer to catch up on their bills. Adding additional hardship to those most vulnerable makes absolutely no sense. If we're all expected to shelter in place in order to save lives, we must have homes to protect us. Anything less will cause even more problems and take that much longer to resolve. Temple City need to enact a provision that bans late fees now and grant rent forgiveness. Public comment number 4. I'm a single mother working 2 jobs, and now both jobs are out due to coronavirus, and income has been affected. Please help me and my daughter in these hard times and pass the rent freeze bill. Public comment number 6. I live in Temple City. I'm a citizen of Los Angeles, and I'm emailing to demand a comprehensive rent freeze during the state of emergency. Due to mass commercial closure and widespread unemployment in the wake of COVID-19, countless residents in Temple City are losing income and unable to make rent, mortgage payments, on top of paying for food, survival, and medical supplies. Many of Temple City's families, including my own, are comprised of retired, sick, and vulnerable people who will face intense financial hardship and even loss of shelter if a comprehensive rent freeze is not implemented. I hope you take this request seriously for the well-being of myself and my neighbors. Stable housing is crucial to follow the governor's plan of social distancing to control the spread of this epidemic and public health. In other words, nobody should have to worry about paying for shelter in the face of a devastating and life-threatening epidemic. It is your duty as a city to push this policy through to the best of your ability. We must act now to suspend all rent payment, city, state, and nationwide, in addition to the indefinite moratorium on evictions and housing closure. And then the very last email, I wouldn't categorize this as a public comment, but an email nonetheless regarding the rent moratorium, and it's from the California Apartment Association. And they requested that council add certain language into the moratorium. And it is available for the public's inspection if they wish to see it. We'll make that available. And that's
Okay.
all.
Thank you. Any other public comments?
I did not receive any additional emails.
Okay, thank you. So
Mayor Chavez,
yes,
could
Yep.
I have Peggy read what the language is that they wanted to change? I don't have that document handy.
yeah, that was, I believe that's a reference to a letter we all got sent to us by email. Peggy,
I was just
why
wondering
don't-
what the language was specifically.
why don't, yeah, I've seen the letter and I don't mind doing that. Peggy, if you don't mind just reading what those recommendations were by the Landlords Association.
Sure. There are 4 bullet points. The first one is they're urging council to consider the following. When a tenant is opting into the moratorium program, they should provide documentation that their loss of income is directly related to the COVID-19 outbreak. The moratorium should only apply to non-payment of rent. All other lease violations should not be included. Number 2, the moratorium should not be viewed as a rent waiver or rent forgiveness. It should be viewed as a deferral. Upon completion of the moratorium, a time period to pay the deferral should be instituted. Number 3, it will not be a violation of the moratorium for housing providers to ask tenant to pay a minimum rent payment, such as 25%. The tenant must provide a notice to the property owner or manager of their intention to participate in the moratorium before the rent is due to allow the housing provider time to prepare for the loss in rent. And the last one, the emergency period should be in 30-day interval and reevaluated every 30 days. This is to ensure we're not extending emergency regulations when this crisis subsides. The city should send a strong message to other utility providers, financial institutions, and the county assessor that they give ample latitude to housing providers who have residents unable to pay rent because of the emergency. The city must set aside funds to help all impacted residents and businesses, including housing providers. Emergency funds must be made available to help everyone in these difficult times. The coronavirus is everyone's problem. Let's find a consistent, equitable approach that will help the entire community, including small businesses and housing providers, get through this difficult time while maintaining their health, their home, their financial security. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I will close public comment. This is our time for any further council questions and or comments. And I'll go ahead and start with council member.
I'm sorry, did you call me? You cut off at the end.
Yes, council member Van.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Sorry about that.
Okay, thank you, Mayor Chavez. Yeah, there's a lot to dig through here. But before I get into my comments, I did have 1 or 2 additional questions that came up as the public comments were being read. So perhaps maybe Mr. Murphy, you might be able to help me out here.
Go ahead.
Now, one of the public comments referred to a rent freeze. Now, can you, because I think that's a common maybe misunderstanding from residents what exactly a rent freeze means, because I think some people interpret it as rent forgiveness, as in they don't have to pay rent at all. For some cities that, like you mentioned, Oakland, so Oakland instituted something that the media was calling a rent freeze, but as you stated, it wasn't really rent forgiveness, it was just rents couldn't be raised. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir. In Oakland, they said that there would be a moratorium on rent increase. So during the period of time that the moratorium is in play, no increase, even the increase that's currently allowed by the new state law, could go into effect. The landlords would have to wait until after the moratorium was over to take any kind of rental increase. As the city of Oakland said, and I'm looking right now at theirs, sir, in section 9 of theirs, there is no relief from liability for rent. Their tenants will still be liable for rent, just liable at the end of the moratorium period. So they, much like what we're doing, they are being encouraged to work out some kind of payment plan so that they're not going to, at the end of their moratorium period, have a gigantic sum of rent that they have to pay all at once. The whole point of this is to try and help these people out who are potentially losing homes or potentially losing their business locations, but to do so in a way that allows them to work out a deal with their landlord, if at all possible.
Okay, thank you. The other question I had, I was reading through our ordinance while everyone was talking, and it goes back to the first question that I had asked earlier about whether our ordinance is tied to the state or the county. And I'm just reading section 9 of our draft ordinance, and I guess it appears that the language we're writing it is explicitly tying it to the governor's executive order.
Yes, sir, and I apologize for that. That was changed late on Friday when the governor issued his own housing moratorium. I apologize, sir. We made the switch to the governor's order, and we did so in somewhat of a rush because it now appears as though everyone is falling in line with the state, and that the statewide order will be the most likely one to be the longest order. That the counties are continuing to look at what activities are allowable or not within the county, but that as long as there is a statewide shelter at home ordinance or statewide shelter at home executive order, that order is going to be certainly going to apply throughout the state and will be followed. If it is your desire, sir, for us to put in both the county and the state order in section 9, I'd be more than happy to add the county back in.
Yeah, I really don't have an opinion as to which order we should be following, just as long as our residents and business owners who may be impacted are clear about what our ordinance is specifically tied to. Just you hear all the different agencies have their own press releases. This last 2 weeks have been crazy, right? Press release after press release. So there could be potentially a lot of confusion from people saying, well, which one are we exactly following or listening to? It's pretty easy to kind of get them all mixed up together. So I guess for anyone who may be watching or who will be looking through this, at least we have clarity written in our ordinance specifically tying it to the governor's executive order.
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. So anyway, just going back to comments, as we've been talking about throughout the whole meeting, this is unprecedented times, and unprecedented times calls for unprecedented measures. And the way I see it, the governor's action as well as the county board of supervisors action and the potential action that we're taking, we're looking out for the most vulnerable of our residents by allowing them or giving them the option to defer their rent payments 6 months till after the emergency is officially ended. So I think one of the most common questions I had from residents emailing or calling me is, again, the confusion about rent deferral versus rent forgiveness. So my understanding is ours is in line with a lot of the other larger jurisdictions, such as LA County and some of the other cities Mr. City Attorney mentioned, that this is a deferral of rent payment and not a rent forgiveness. So I think, granted, we don't know when the emergency is officially going to be declared over. So I think when we're talking about equitable solutions, I agree with, I think Councilmember Sternquist mentioned, it's going to be hard to find one where everyone's going to agree that, oh, that's fair for everyone. Absolutely. I'm thinking of a situation where, what if the emergency extends to August? Like we don't know when it's going to end. So from someone who may be depending on rent for a mortgage payment or whatnot, like I think Mayor Pro Tem brought up this point is when one of his questions is there any recourse for landlords legally to not be affected? So I think the way I see it is, it seems like we have the flexibility. We will be discussing this. You know, we say this this issue is very fluid, so it's subject to change. If things get very different, then I'm sure we as a council will probably be discussing this sooner than later to see if there's any changes that need to be made. But as of now, I think kind of following the template that was molded by some of the other jurisdictions, I think this is a good way to help and assist the most vulnerable of our residents. And I would very much be in favor of what we have before us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilmember Fish. Any questions or comments? I think you're on mute.
Hello?
Yeah,
Can you hear me? Okay. I have a question about, there was no mention of late fees. So I think that might, oh, I shouldn't say might, I think it should be added, because I wouldn't want landlords to be able to charge a late fee or a percentage if they're not going to be able to pay their rent in full. And there was no mention of that. I mean, I think we're all thinking that.
Yes, ma'am. My apologies. That is a part of Section 5. There is no late fee or any equivalent surcharge for rent payments that are unable to be made due to COVID-19 or the health orders. So that is in there, and I apologize for not raising that earlier. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. The other thing is, I would like to see a rent. I hate to use the word freeze, but I would like to see that included, that landlords would not be able to raise the rent in the next 6 months or when the moratorium takes effect. Again, I don't know if anybody else wants to discuss that. I think this is a bad time to raise rent. I will say this is a very difficult thing. I know that there's many people out there that rely on rent to pay the mortgage, and I think it's going to be very hard for many people to be able to make mortgage payments on properties without rent. But I also realize that we have to protect our residents. I would hate for residents to lose their homes at this particular time after losing their jobs, trying to find a place to live, having no income. it's just added stress for our residents. I would have to agree with Councilmember Mann that we have to do all we can to help our residents at this time. This is something that we could never have prepared for. It does change on a daily basis. It's not even weekly or monthly. Every single day, there's some type of a different report, change, statistics that come out, and we really don't know what's going to happen in a week or a month or 6 months. But I do think that we have to protect our residents, protect their families, and make sure that they do have somewhere to live. So I would have to agree with this. Like I said, I know it's not easy because I do know many people that own rental properties, and it's a tough time for everyone. And I think we're going to have to pull together. I would hope and I would suggest that if renters cannot pay the rent, to contact their landlords as soon as possible and make some type of arrangement to pay maybe half, pay a few $100s, not get very behind, because at the end of 6 months, they will have to pay it in full. And that's the part I think people forget. They think, well, maybe, I don't have to pay it for a month or two, but at the end of 6 months, they're still going to have to come up with that money. So I would hope that they would take it seriously and keep up, of course, with their rent if they can. If they can't, at least pay what they can. And of course, tell their landlords as soon as possible, because again, the landlords do have to make compensation for that lost revenue. And they also have bills. And so that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem, you?
I am in agreement with the ordinance and concept, but I really need to point out, as the other council member had alluded to, landlords need to pay bills too, and we tend to perhaps think of landlords as multimillionaires having unlimited resources to live from paycheck to paycheck. And just to be completely transparent, I don't own any property, and I'm not a landlord. But I do know that people, sometimes different families put together their finances to buy the properties, and they have a hard time making mortgage if they don't get the rent. So I am, I'm sensitive to that. But I think for the purpose of this ordinance, the fact that it's only in effect until May 31st, or at the end of any health order plus 6 months, I think it's perhaps a well-balanced way of approaching this issue. I don't necessarily think that having rent freeze is necessarily needed, because I think if we have this ordinance out there, it's really a message to our landlords. I mean, you cannot evict people, so you may as well, even though we didn't come out to say so, you may as well not increase the rent, because people are not gonna. You cannot evict people when they cannot pay. So I personally don't see the need to increase that to add that language in there. But I'll be able, but I can support this ordinance the way it is.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Sternquist.
Yeah, thank you, council members, for your thoughts. I have a few thoughts on this, and something just to take note of is that there's probably quite a few people that, if we threw a net out there, are both residents of Temple City and owned rental property in Temple City. And in our small community, I know there's at least two of us on council who are both residents and landlords. So when I think about this ordinance, I've tried to, dissect it, have spoken numerous times to Greg, who's been so gracious to answer my questions and concerns. There are probably a couple of things that I feel as both a resident and landlord that would make me feel personally, and I'm sure there's other landlords out there that are residents of Temple City also, that would feel a little bit more comfortable with having some inclusion in the ordinance. And I had spoken to Greg about these, and he said the best time would be to bring it up now. And a couple of them in particular where I don't see, Greg, and maybe I'm missing it, I don't think I asked you this, is there anything in the ordinance that says you should notify your landlord within 7 days after your rent payment is due? If not, I think that is a provision that both people such as myself and other landlords would appreciate having in there, so that there is at least some timeliness in having a landlord know what a tenant is wanting to do. And I don't
Sure.
know if I see a time frame in there.
Sure. So in section 4, the tenant has to notify the landlord in writing with documentation, but it's currently set at 30 days. If it's the will of the council to change that, I'd be more than happy to modify that for you.
Well,
Okay, and I think maybe my confusion was that many of the ordinances that I have read, and I believe the counties also, is, well, maybe not the counties, but many of the cities that have adopted ordinances are 7 days. And that seems much more realistic to me, that if someone has lost their job, and we all know that rent's coming up, what, April 1st is when, is that today or tomorrow? I don't know time anymore, but I would hope that by now people have a pretty clear idea of who is working and who is essential workers and who is not. Many cities have done similar things as far as what we've worked on previously with the extending employees' pay. So I think those things are in place with a lot of cities, but I do think that moving that up from 30 to 7 would make me much more comfortable in at least giving a landlord, I mean, this is pretty much a one-sided ordinance, and I agree that we need to do it. I just think there's some relief, whatever we can offer a landlord, that would help them. And changing that date to 30 days, I mean, because you can go 30 days and not know whether or not you're going to get a payment from your tenant. And I believe that was one of the comments from the apartment housing thing that Peggy read to us. And there was another one. Oh, I know one of the things that our mayor referred to, and I think is of utmost importance to landlords, and even receiving emails for both, in favor of the ordinance or making an adjustment to the ordinance or not supporting the ordinance, was there should be some reference to documentation. And I don't recall exactly what I provided you, Greg, with, but even if you put an example such as, a letter from your work, a letter from your doctor, so that it's not as ambiguous as just, it has to be related to the CV-19. I think that is too ambiguous. And even if we're not saying these are the things that are required, but we refer to them, it kind of gives the court an idea, should it ever be contested, as to what the importance of the documentation is. It's just not, well, my neighbor thought I was sick and I just self-quarantined myself. So I think that is too ambiguous, and I can support this ordinance with those two inclusions into it. Just my thoughts.
Okay. Councilmember Fisher, you have your hand up?
No,
Oh,
No.
okay.
sorry. No, I'm thinking, sorry.
All right, no problem. All right, is that it, Councilmember Sternquist?
That's it.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, again, thank you for all your comments. I do have a couple to make, a couple of questions. First of all, Greg, maybe you can answer this, and I think there's been a few questions in this regard, and as far as whose order takes precedent. I kind of struggle with that myself, even from a legal standpoint. I mean, I know that when it comes down between state laws and federal laws under our supremacy laws statutes, or under our supremacy laws, federal takes precedent over state. How does that work with county and state orders or local orders? I would imagine that there's a hierarchy of which takes precedent. Do you have any sense of that?
Sure, yes. The state orders normally take precedence, and in fact, the first draft of this said that if the state issued any order, or the federal government issued any order dealing with rent relief, rent deferral, that this order would actually become immediately of no further force and effect. Luckily, the governor issued his executive order Friday before we sent the agenda out. And so we were able to slightly modify this. Am I fully comfortable with having a state order and also having local orders? No, I'm not, because it's normally the case that if the state has ruled on a matter, that's the end of it. But because the governor has explicitly said that he expects local jurisdictions to take action stronger than what he did, I do feel fine with what we're doing. I know that there are some cities who adopted a moratorium similar to this prior to Friday, that then came back late on Friday or else yesterday and reaffirmed their moratorium in light of the governor's order and the governor's statement. So I think you are within your rights to adopt this if you'd like, and it will go into effect. It won't be superseded by what the governor has done.
Okay, thank you. There's been a couple of comments also about landlords and the recourse for landlords, and I don't disagree with the comments. There's no question that at this point it's like balance, which is the lesser of two evils at this point. We don't want people thrown out on the street for obvious reasons, given the nature of the virus that's going around. At the same time, of course, as mentioned before, landlords have bills to pay as well. I think that's for perhaps another discussion, and I would hope that, of course, our state, county, and federal governments would address that issue, because they have more of the financial ability to make those rules than we would ever be able to do. Hopefully they'll get the message. I think you mentioned earlier, Greg, that landlords are in the position to get loans. Obviously, they have property that they can put up for collateral, whereas most renters won't. So they do have that advantage when it comes to that. But as far as recourse, as far as financial aid, perhaps our county, our state, our federal will hear that message as more and more local jurisdictions try to do what they can to help out the renters as well. So hopefully that will come to fruition at some point. As far as Councilmember Sternquist's comments, I tend to agree with the comment regarding the notice. I think 30 days is probably a little too lengthy at this point. I think if someone is not going to be able to pay their rent, to wait 30 days to notify their landlord, that means they're already a month behind. And so I think shortening that time, whether it be 7, 10 days, I don't know. We don't have a magic wand, I guess, but I don't know if you've got any insight into that, if you've seen it in other jurisdictions. I believe, and maybe Councilmember Sternquist, I forget what you said about this, but maybe there are others that are looking at this that or have a lesser notice period, and what those periods are. I know I wouldn't want 7 days, but
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I mean, I'm comfortable with 10. Also,
Yeah.
I just happened to look. I know Berkeley, Emeryville, the city of Alameda, you know, there's quite a few, and it wasn't 30 days. I think 30 days is just a long time, but I'd be comfortable with 10 days also, Mayor.
I would agree with you, and I think that for some reason that 10-day period, I don't know why it stands in my mind. Maybe I don't do unlawful detainers anymore, but I know that there are time periods in there, and you know, to say 7 days, sometimes it's good, especially if there's a weekend involved in there, maybe to go to that extra couple of days. So I certainly would support maybe a 10-day notice period. I think that'll balance a little bit for the landlords, as well as it'll give the tenant a lot of the opportunity to do that. As far as documentation, Greg, I'll leave that up to you to decide if there's something that you think from a legal standpoint that we want to be more specific in that, or is it better? Sometimes with these ordinance, I know I don't want to say it's better to be vague, but sometimes you don't want to, put something there that's so specific that's all there is, and then nothing else will matter. I don't know if there's any thought process you have on that right now regarding the documentation. You feel comfortable? Because I know I had that as one of my questions earlier. What type of documentation is needed? And I know, tell me again the code section that talks about the notice. I think that's section 4. Is that it?
Section 4 talks about notice to the landlord, and that the tenant has to provide documentation. It has to be in writing, and we reference medical and financial information.
Yeah, any medical information. But that's the part that will be held in confidence. So I don't know. I mean, is it limited to? I guess limited to medical information. Cindy, go ahead.
I'm going to share one that I thought was pretty comprehensive. It says renters must provide landlord with written documentation demonstrating at least, this one was more specific, but at least a 20% reduction of monthly gross pay as a result of a layoff or reduction in hours caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, or because of medical or childcare needs or expenses arising from school closures or childhood closures. And theirs is a very short window. They're asking for like 3 days, but I'm comfortable with the 10. I just, I don't know. I'm not an attorney, but I just think it makes me feel a little bit more comfortable knowing that the documentation is, pretty intense documentation. It's something more than you just have to provide documentation. Well, what does that mean exactly?
Well, again, that's why we have courts to flush that out. I don't know that I would be in favor of a percentage. That might be a little bit too much.
Yeah, I don't like the percentage either. I was just reading what they said.
I think, and again, we're not going to enforce this. We're telling tenants and landlords, look, you better have some documentation. And ultimately, it's going to be up to the court to decide if that was sufficient or not, I would imagine, Greg. I think maybe that's something that we need to at least highlight again, is that as a tenant, you must be prepared to provide, sufficient documentation, to support, your inability to pay rent as a result of the coronavirus. And I don't know, maybe take some of the language that we use in the having to do with the paid administrative leave. It seems like there's some language in there that talks about that a little bit more. And then again, since we're not going to be enforcing it, I think a landlord would still have the right. Correct me if I'm wrong, Greg, but if the landlord felt that they were not provided with sufficient documentation, they could move forward with an eviction and let a judge decide whether or not they were given. If the judge finds in their favor, then I'm assuming the eviction will go forward.
The eviction does go forward, yes, sir. And that's if all that somebody provides is, for example, that the school was shut down and provides no information about whether they were still being paid, but just that school was shut down, and then saying that therefore I have to stay home and I can't work. but provides no financial information to back that up, well then, as you say, sir, that's for a judge to decide, is that sufficient or is that lacking? And if the judge finds that that's lacking, then the eviction will go forward.
Okay,
Is
then that, I'm okay with that. I like the word sufficient.
Yeah,
I don't know if ours says sufficient, does it?
no.
I can certainly add that in.
Okay.
I think, you know, and you know, I think obviously judges are gonna always have their own interpretation of it. Unless it comes down either from state or federal that defines as better, I think we're better off just leaving it up to the courts to decide at this point. And I think it gives enough leverage, and I think it really comes back to kind of just logical sense. I mean, as Greg said, if a tenant simply says, look, I'm not paying the rent this month because of the virus, that ain't gonna cut it. I mean,
Right.
so they're gonna have to be put on, they're gonna really have to, and I think it's clear that they have to, it's their burden. And that might be something that maybe in our public publicizes, is to emphasize that it is the burden of the tenant to provide that information, not for the landlord. Correct, Greg?
Correct. Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. Well, those are all my comments. Anybody else would like to follow up based on anything that's been said so far? I'm not hearing anything. So at this point,
I wouldn't mind to just repeat what some of the revisions that we're talking.
well, I think at least in my mind, and correct me if I'm wrong, all of you, but it seems that there's consensus so far to move forward with the ordinance with maybe a couple of minor adjustments. One would be the notice requirements from 30 to 10 days. And then on the, as far as the documentation, to include the word sufficient, or Greg, whatever you think would be enough in there to at least put the burden on the tenant that they must know that they have to present sufficient information.
I think both of those are good, sir. And so that's page 2 in section 4. The second line is where we're changing 30 days to 10. And the third line, about a third of the way in between the words provides and documentation, we add the word sufficient. And I think that that meets what I've been hearing so far.
Vince, is that?
Yep.
Okay, good. All right. Unless there are any further comments or questions, I'll go ahead and entertain a motion at this time. Who would like to go forward? Don't all rush.
Mr. Mayor, I would move that the city council find that the recommended action is exempt from CEQA and consider adoption by forfeit vote the following ordinance number 20-1041U, and emergency ordinance of the city council temporarily prohibiting eviction of residential commercial tenant arising out of financial impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, subject to the amendment discussed.
Okay,
A
thank you.
second?
All right, we have a motion and a second. Or is there any objection? Hearing none, we'll ask for. I'm sorry,
Yeah,
go ahead.
No, I was going to say we do need roll call tonight.
I'm way ahead of you. Go ahead, roll call.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. Councilmember Fish,
Yes.
Councilmember Mann,
Yes.
Councilmember Sternquist,
Yeah.
Mayor Pro Tem Yu,
Yes.
Mayor Chavez.
Yes. Okay, so that ordinance passes unanimously, and so that will go into effect immediately. I just want to add, and I think, Brian, I think you can hear from the comments that I think it's very important that we publicize and maybe even have an information sheet available to both landlords and tenants as to the import of this new ordinance, maybe a frequently asked questions, something like that we've done with previous types of things. Do you think the staff would be able to accomplish that?
Mayor Chavez, in anticipation of tonight's meeting, we actually have somewhat of a draft ready. Mr. Haworth and team are ready, and that should be out sometime tomorrow.
Okay, I knew you were gonna say, thank you very much for that. So, okay, all right. I believe that concludes our business for the evening. So, before we sign off, I just want to tell everybody to stay healthy and stay safe. You all look great so far, so keep doing what you're doing. And Greg, when I see your dad, I'm gonna tell him to stay home again.
Thank you, sir.
All right, you guys have a good evening, and we are now adjourned. Thank you.